March 22nd, 1945. Late night. The west bank of the Rhine near Oppenheim, south of Mainz. George S. Patton is staring at the one river every German commander in the West still wants to believe can save them. Not as water. As a verdict. For months, the Rhine has existed in the German mind as the last clean answer. The last barrier wide enough, deep enough, and symbolic enough to force the Americans into doing this the proper way. Slow build-up, heavy artillery, engineer preparation, bridges, smoke, delay, friction, time, above all, time. And time is the one thing Germany still needs. Because by March 1945, Germany no longer has enough fuel, enough aircraft, enough trained infantry, enough mobile reserves, or enough coherent command left in the West to stop the Americans in open country for very long. What it still has are rivers, demolitions, ruined cities, and the hope that geography can do what divisions no longer can. That is why the obvious crossing matters so much. If Patton behaves like a prudent commander, if he goes where the map says he should go, if he assaults where every reasonable officer would expect him to assault, then the Germans get the one thing they still know how to use: prepared resistance, registered fire, organized delay. Patton looks at the same map and comes to the opposite conclusion. Which is why this story matters. Because this is not a story about a man simply charging harder than everyone else. That version is too easy, too shallow, too childish for what was really happening by the spring of 1945. The truth is sharper than that. Patton was dangerous not because he ignored geography, but because he read it faster than the enemy did. He understood that the obvious crossing site was obvious to both sides. And once a crossing becomes obvious to both sides, it stops being attractive. Mainz made sense on paper. That was exactly the problem. The Germans expected pressure near Mainz. They expected the Americans to do what a major army is supposed to do when it reaches the greatest river in Western Europe. Build up. Signal the blow. Reveal the intention. Fight the river first, and the defenders second. Patton decided to reverse that order. He would not cross where the Germans were most comfortable expecting him. He would cross where the crossing seemed awkward enough to feel wrong. South of Mainz, near Oppenheim and Nierstein, a place complicated by the main river and dismissed precisely because it was not the clean answer. Think about what that means. The Germans were still thinking like professionals defending the final barrier to Germany. Patton was thinking like a predator looking for the one place professionalism had become predictable. And by the evening of March 22nd, the trap was set. Orders had come down fast. Too fast for comfort. Men who expected more time got hours. Assault boats were hauled forward in darkness. Engineers moved with the tense silence that comes before a river crossing, because river crossings are among the few operations in war where every man involved understands the shape of the danger before it begins. The most dangerous part is not the near bank. It is not even the far bank. It is the middle. That strip of black water where you belong to neither side and both sides can kill you. Patton knew that too, which is why the plan was built around the one weapon stronger than artillery for a few precious minutes. Surprise! No massive opening barrage. No long theatrical announcement that the Americans had arrived and the crossing had begun. Guns were ready, of course. They were always ready. But the point was to keep them silent unless silence failed. That detail tells you everything about the operation. This was not supposed to be a grand spectacle. It was supposed to become a fact before the Germans fully understood it was happening. On the other side of the river stood the defenders of a collapsing state still pretending it had one last intact frontier. That was the illusion. The Rhine was real. The defense behind it was not nearly as complete as the symbol suggested. German formations in the West had been retreating, fragmenting, improvising, and losing the ability to turn maps into reality. Orders still existed. Units still existed. The words still existed. But the substance inside them was thinning. That is one of the deepest patterns of late-war Germany. From a distance, everything still looked structured. Up close, too much of it was already running on habit, exhaustion, and hope. And hope does not stop assault boats. So the night came down over Oppenheim. Bright moon, cold air, the river dark and wide, infantry of the 5th Infantry Division moving to the bank, engineers ready behind them, boats waiting. The kind of silence that is never really silence in war. The scrape of equipment. The low murmur of men keeping their voices flat so fear does not become visible. Somewhere out there on the East Bank, German sentries, machine guns, and half-awake defenders still trying to understand whether this sector mattered. That uncertainty was the opening. At Nierstein, the first Americans crossed and found something almost absurd in its simplicity. Shock, confusion, stunned defenders. Men who had not yet processed that the real assault was arriving here. At Oppenheim, the river behaved more like the Rhine of German expectation. The first wave pushed out, boats cut into black water. Then, halfway across, the far bank came alive. Machine gun fire, tracers, sudden violence slashing across the river exactly where crossing is weakest. This is the moment where the story stops being a clever operational idea and becomes a test of whether the Americans can force the idea into reality before it dies in the current. Men kept rowing, kept pushing, kept going forward because there is no elegant correction once a night river crossing has been detected in the middle. You do not pause, you do not reorganize, you do not ask for a better version of the same moment. You keep going, or you turn the river into a graveyard. And this is where the deeper story begins to show itself. Not bravery alone. Bravery was everywhere in this war, and it explains less than people think. The more important truth is that by 1945, the American Army had become extremely dangerous at compressing the time between recognition and action. That is what the Germans kept running into in different forms. Not just more men, not just more tanks, not just more airplanes, a faster military metabolism, a system that could identify an opening and move through it before the enemy finished naming it. The Germans had once terrified Europe by doing exactly that. Now they were facing an American army that had learned how to do it at industrial scale. That is what makes this crossing worth a full script. Not just that Patton crossed the Rhine, not just that he did it fast, but that he did it in a way the Germans did not truly believe he would try. They expected the formal blow. He gave them the uncomfortable one. They expected a textbook crossing. He gave them a night assault in the sector that looked just awkward enough to be dismissed. They expected to fight the river first. He forced them to fight surprise first. That was the real reversal. And once the first men got onto the East Bank and started widening the landing area, once the first resistance points were hit before the defenders could organize a coherent answer, the whole meaning of the operation changed. A bridgehead in its first moments is only a possibility. Then, very suddenly, it becomes geography. That is what happened at Oppenheim. For a short time, the crossing was fragile, exposed, and reversible. Then, the Americans got enough men across, enough ground seized, enough momentum built, and the operation crossed the invisible line that matters most in war. It stopped being a gamble and became a fact. By then, the Germans were no longer deciding whether to prevent the crossing. They were already late. They were deciding how to react to a crossing that was happening. And that is a much worse kind of decision to be forced into in the spring of 1945. Because once Patton got over the Rhine, the river stopped being Germany's shield and became Germany's accusation. It meant the last great Western barrier had not bought what it was supposed to buy. Not enough time. Not enough order, not enough recovery, not enough future. And that is why the title works. The Rhine crossing the Germans never believed Patton would try is not just a dramatic phrase. It is the core of the whole event. The crossing was powerful precisely because it violated expectation. It appeared where a major American assault was not supposed to appear. It happened faster than the defenders were comfortable imagining. And it exposed the most dangerous truth left in the West by March 1945. Germany was still strong enough to imagine delay. It was no longer strong enough to survive surprise. And once that fact settled in, once the first American foothold on the East Bank stopped being a rumor and started becoming a problem measured in battalions instead of boats, the entire psychological structure of the Western Front shifted. Because rivers do not just block movement, they organize expectation. They tell defenders where the enemy must slow down. They tell tired staffs where there is still time to think. They tell retreating armies where the chaos might finally become a line. The Rhine had been doing that work for Germany for weeks. Even men who no longer believed in victory could still believe in the river. That is what Patton took from them. Not just a bank of water, not just a crossing site. He took the last comfortable assumption. And the moment that assumption broke, everything east of the Rhine started looking different. Think about the German side of this for a second. A staff officer receives word in the dark that Americans are across near Oppenheim. Not probing, not shelling, not feinting. Across. The first instinct is disbelief, because disbelief is always the cheapest reaction when reality arrives in the wrong place. Then comes reinterpretation. It must be a raid. It must be a temporary penetration. It must be a local crossing that can be sealed before dawn. That is how armies protect themselves from panic. They translate the shocking fact into a smaller category. But this is exactly where late-war Germany was most vulnerable. Too many facts were already arriving too fast, too late, and in the wrong places. Too many local emergencies were actually pieces of a wider collapse. So by the time the reports began to align, by the time it became clear that this was not a nuisance but a real bridgehead, the Americans had already done the one thing that matters most in a river assault. They had survived the first hour. That is the hidden threshold in crossings like this. The maps make the river look like the central obstacle. It is not. The central obstacle is time. How much time does the defender have between detecting the crossing and realizing its scale? How much time does the attacker have between landing and being smashed back into the water? How much time do the engineers have before fire finds the approaches? How much time do commanders have to convert a dangerous possibility into a self-sustaining fact? Patton's genius here was not mystical. It was temporal. He understood that if he could make the Germans start the clock late, the river itself might become manageable. And that is exactly what happened. While German commanders were still trying to decide what category of threat they were looking at, American infantry was already pushing outward from the landing area, clawing for the little bits of ground that make a bridgehead harder to erase. Small roads, ditches, clusters of buildings, tree lines, the unromantic geometry of expansion. That is how facts are built in war. Not in one dramatic stroke, but in a series of local decisions that slowly become irreversible. The first men over are not there to admire the success of the crossing. They are there to widen it before the enemy can name it correctly. And behind them came the next layer of the machine. Engineers, boats turning back and forth through dark water. More infantry, more ammunition, radios, wire, command posts dragging themselves toward functionality in the black hours before dawn. This is where the romantic version of river warfare usually gets the story wrong. People remember the first wave because it is visible and cinematic. But the true weight of the crossing sits on the men who make the second, third, and fourth wave possible. Because without them, courage becomes a brief event. With them, courage becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure is what the Germans were now losing to everywhere. That is one of the deepest themes in the reference style you gave me. Again and again, the visible clash turns out to be only the surface of the real mechanism. A tank battle is actually a battle of systems. A sniper duel is actually a battle of doctrine and weapon rhythm. A bridge seizure is actually a battle over who can build continuity faster. The Oppenheim crossing fits that pattern perfectly. On the surface, it is a surprise river assault. Underneath, it is the United States Army demonstrating that by 1945 it could identify an opening, force men through it, and then feed the opening so quickly that the enemy never gets to fight the neat, contained version of the problem he wants. That is what made Patton terrifying at this stage of the war. Not his speeches, not the revolvers, not the mythology that grew around him afterward. The truly frightening thing was that his army could smell operational weakness and then accelerate into it before a weary opponent could recover his balance. And Germany in March 1945 was an exhausted opponent living on delayed reactions. That is why the crossing south of Mainz mattered so much. Not because it was the biggest crossing of the war, it was not. Not because it was the most famous, it was not. But because it struck the German command mind in precisely the place where the command mind was weakest. It demanded immediate reinterpretation from a system that had become progressively worse at reinterpretation. It arrived in a sector that did not fit the strongest defensive expectation. It came at night. It came fast. It came without the ritual warning signals that major American attacks were supposed to give off. And then it grew before the defenders finished deciding how shocked they should be. That is why the title is not exaggeration. The Germans really did not believe Patton would try it this way. They believed he was aggressive, yes. Dangerous, yes. They did not believe he would compress preparation that hard on a river that important. They still expected a crossing that looked like a crossing. What they got instead was the opening phase of a pursuit operation disguised as an assault. And once daylight came, the real scale of the damage began to show. Because daylight is when a crossing stops being rumor and becomes visibility. Ferries start moving. Heavy equipment begins edging toward the far bank. Engineers begin converting improvisation into permanence. The East Bank starts filling with evidence that what happened at night was not a raid, but the front line changing shape. And this is the part German commanders understood with a kind of cold, professional dread. A successful night crossing is dangerous. A successful night crossing that survives into daylight is far worse. Because now the attacker can begin doing what Patton always wanted to do after any rupture in the line. Exploit. Not pause to admire. Not stop to decorate the moment with symbolism. Drive. Spread. Deepen. Force the enemy to make decisions on roads he has not secured and from headquarters that are already behind the pace of events. This was the same operational cruelty that had defined the best German campaigns earlier in the war. But now it was being applied against Germany itself. That is one of the ironies that gives this whole story its force. The Wehrmacht had spent years teaching Europe what it meant to be punished by speed. By 1945, the Americans had learned the lesson and scaled it with more trucks, more fuel, more artillery, more bridging, more radios, and a command structure that was increasingly comfortable acting before the picture was complete. That last part matters. Armies get old in war, not just when they lose men, but when they lose confidence in incomplete information. They start waiting for the picture to clear. Patton hated that instinct. He preferred a dangerous decision now to a cleaner decision later, if later meant giving the enemy time. That is what you're seeing at Oppenheim. Not recklessness, not theatrical bravado. Controlled impatience weaponized at exactly the right moment. And the Germans, even when they understood the crossing, faced another brutal problem. Stopping a crossing is not the same thing as rolling back a crossing. The first is a defensive act. The second is an offensive act. It requires reserves, timing, local superiority, roads that still function, units that can move without collapsing into piecemeal reaction, and above all, officers who believe they are moving toward a problem that still has a clean solution. Germany in the West had less and less of that left. It still had dangerous men. It still had guns. It still had local resistance and pockets of fury, and all the violence of a state refusing to die gracefully. But more and more of its reactions were partial, late, understrength, fragmented. That is why the Oppenheim crossing matters beyond the river itself. It revealed the difference between danger and control. Germany was still dangerous. It was no longer in control. The Americans, meanwhile, were doing exactly what a victorious army should do after a successful forced crossing. They were thickening the bridgehead faster than the enemy could normalize it. Once more, units crossed. Once more, roads on the east bank were seized. Once more, space was gained inland. The operational question changed again. It was no longer, can the Americans hold this crossing? It became, how far can they turn this crossing into a door? That is a much worse question for a defender because it multiplies the places where failure can now appear. The river line has not just been pierced, it has been converted into a base for further uncertainty. Every mile gained inland means the next German line has less time to exist. Every American truck or tank that reaches the far bank makes the original night crossing seem less like a gamble and more like a diagnosis, and Patton knew it. That is why he wanted the news out immediately. He understood that crossings work on morale in both directions. To your own side, they prove momentum is real. To the enemy, they prove the barrier has failed. Once word spread that Third Army was across, the event began doing work far beyond its local sector. It told American formations that the final Western River was no longer a future problem. It told German formations that even here, even now, even on the Rhine, the Americans were still ahead of the clock. And there is another layer here that makes the story richer than a simple victory narrative. Patton did not just want to cross the Rhine, he wanted to cross it first, or at least fast enough to deny the psychological center of the event to someone else. There was ego in that, of course. There was rivalry. There was theater. But there was also operational instinct. Commanders like Patton understood that when multiple great movements are converging on the same strategic barrier, tempo is not vanity. Tempo shapes the story the enemy is forced to live inside. If one Allied army crosses after weeks of preparation, the Germans can still tell themselves the barrier did what it was meant to do. If Patton is already over before the larger, cleaner, more deliberate crossing dominates the headlines, then the Rhine starts looking less like a fortress and more like a deadline missed. That matters. Armies collapse in matter as much as in material. And by March 1945, Germany was bleeding both. So when you look at Oppenheim the right way, the crossing stops being a dramatic anecdote and turns into something more severe. It becomes a measurement of how much war Germany could still wage on its own preferred terms. The answer was, not enough. Not enough to force Patton into the expected sector. Not enough to delay the crossing until a full formal defense could solidify. Not enough to treat the Americans as predictable. Not enough to restore the comforting logic that the Rhine would impose order on the battlefield simply by existing. That was the illusion Patton destroyed. The river was still there. The certainty around it was not. And once certainty disappears from a defense, Every report from the front becomes more dangerous, because every officer receiving those reports has to ask the question he least wants to ask at the end of a war. If they crossed here tonight, where else are they already becoming facts by morning? That is where the real fear begins. Not at the waterline, not in the machine gun bursts across black water, not even in the first foothold on the east bank. The real fear begins when the defender understands he is no longer reacting to a single event. He is reacting to a process that has escaped the category he prepared for. That is what Oppenheim became by dawn. And in the next phase, once Patton had men, bridges, armor, and momentum over the river, the story gets even more brutal. Because then the question was no longer whether Germany could stop the crossing. It was whether Germany could survive what came through it. What came through it was the part that German officers feared most, because it was the part no river line can ever fully stop once the first hours go wrong. Not infantry alone. Not a few assault companies clinging to muddy ground. What came through it was continuity. That is the real subject of every successful crossing. Continuity of movement. Continuity of supply, continuity of command, continuity of pressure. The first boats make history visible, but the second day is what decides whether history stays. And Patton understood that as clearly as any commander in Europe. He had not crossed the Rhine to own a headline. He had crossed it to prevent Germany from ever turning the East Bank into a stable problem. So the work began immediately. Engineers pushed ferries into service. More men crossed, more ammunition crossed, anti-tank guns crossed, radios crossed. Trucks began edging toward the river approaches. Officers who had spent the night fighting for a foothold now spent the morning fighting for width. Because width is life in a bridgehead. A narrow crossing can be shelled. A narrow crossing can be strangled. A narrow crossing can be isolated and broken apart. A widening crossing becomes something worse. It starts to generate its own momentum. It starts to force the defender to guess wrong in multiple directions at once. That is exactly what was happening east of Oppenheim. German local resistance did not vanish. That is important. Late war German weakness is often told badly, as if collapse meant passivity. It did not. Collapse made German resistance more jagged, not less violent. Strong points still fired, roads were still contested. Pockets of infantry and guns still had enough discipline to hurt anyone careless enough to assume the war had already decided itself. But that was the problem from the German side. Hurt was no longer the same thing as halt. They could bloody the crossing. They could not restore the line. And once that distinction appears, a defense is in mortal trouble, because from that moment on, every local act of resistance becomes disconnected from an operational purpose. Men still fight, men still kill, but the battlefield around them stops rewarding the effort with recovery. It only delays the speed of defeat by fractions. That is what Patton kept forcing on German units in the final months of the war. He made them spend real blood for increasingly unreal time. By the morning after the crossing, that logic was already tightening around the sector. More American formations were getting over. Bridging crews were pushing forward with the grim focus that only engineers under fire seem to have, because combat engineers live in a different relationship with danger than most soldiers. Infantry can hug the ground, fire back, move hedge to hedge, tree line to ditch. Engineers in an operation like this have to stay with the task. They have to keep building while shells search for them. They have to solve geometry under conditions that make ordinary thought difficult. They have to turn a river from a battlefield back into traffic. And traffic, in a mechanized army, is fate. That is why these moments matter so much in scripts like this. The glamorous version of Patton is always the chase, the breakneck advance, the dust columns. the armored spearheads racing east. But none of that exists without the anonymous labor that makes movement survive contact. The Rhine was not crossed by personality. It was crossed by an army that had become extremely good at taking a dangerous success and feeding it before the enemy could cut the arteries. That is the deeper American story by 1945. The United States Army had learned how to keep momentum alive. And once armor started coming through, the tone of the operation changed again. That is another hidden threshold. Infantry can seize a bridgehead. Armor converts a bridgehead into a future. Tanks do not just add firepower, they add direction. They make roads matter more. They make hesitation cost more. They make every defender on the far bank ask a far more terrible question than whether the enemy is across. They ask how far the enemy can now go before night. That is when the map begins to feel different. That is when rear areas stop feeling rear. That is when staff work becomes triage. Reports come in from villages, crossroads, wooded ridges, minor positions that had seemed comfortably inland only hours before, and suddenly every one of them must be judged not as a static point on a defensive diagram, but as a possible path for American exploitation. This is where Patton was at his most dangerous. Not when he attacked a fixed position head-on, not when he shouted, not when he performed for photographers or subordinates or history. He was most dangerous in the hour after a line had already been bent and before the enemy had accepted how far it had bent. He had a feel for disequilibrium. He understood that when a defender is still mentally fighting for yesterday's shape of the front, the attacker can buy extraordinary mileage with very ordinary units simply by moving before the map catches up. That is what the Germans around Oppenheim were now living inside. They had prepared to defend a river. They were beginning to face a penetration. Those are not the same kind of war at all. A river defense is organized around the bank. A penetration defense is organized around roads, reserves, blocks, flanks, and above all, sequence. Which junction do you hold first? Which village do you sacrifice? Which ridge do you try to turn into a hinge? Which battalion still exists enough to be moved? Which artillery still has ammunition? Which headquarters can still issue something more meaningful than a frightened request? Germany, in March 1945, could still ask all those questions. It increasingly lacked satisfying answers. That is why the story accelerates once you get past the waterline. The crossing itself is dramatic, yes, but the operational cruelty lies in what follows. Once Americans are over in force, every delay in German response grows more expensive because it is no longer buying time against a river assault. It is buying time against an army already rearranging the east bank, and Patton did not intend to stop with proving the crossing possible. He intended to make the Germans pay for every minute they had misread the sector. This is where his impatience, which in weaker tellings of the war is often treated like an eccentric personality trait, becomes something more severe. Impatience in the right command environment is not noise, it is compression. It shortens the interval between opportunity and exploitation. It reduces the number of times a tired opponent gets to say maybe there is still time to fix this. Patton kept taking that sentence away from the enemy. At Oppenheim, he took it away at exactly the right moment. And German commanders knew what that implied. If this bridgehead grew, if more Americans crossed, if bridges became reliable and traffic stabilized, then the Rhine would stop being Germany's final shield in that sector and become instead a line the Americans had already put behind themselves. Think about what that means psychologically. Armies can survive losing ground. They can sometimes survive losing cities. But when a line invested with symbolic finality fails quickly, it drags morale down with it in a way no ordinary tactical reverse can. The Rhine was not just terrain, it was mythology. It was one of the last places where German officers could still tell themselves that geography and national depth might restore order to retreat. Once Patton punctured that confidence from an unexpected direction, the mythology itself started to betray them. Because now, every other river, every other village, every other patch of difficult ground eastward had to be measured against the obvious truth. If the Americans cross the Rhine here like this, what exactly is supposed to stop them next? That is the kind of question that destroys defensive coherence faster than casualties alone. Men begin fighting with the sense that each stand is only local. They still fire, they still resist, but the invisible network of belief tying those actions into a larger solution starts to fray. And once that frays, American exploitation becomes even more dangerous because the enemy's resistance is no longer nested inside a convincing future. This is one reason the late war Western Front moves the way it does in strong narratives. It is not enough to say Germany was losing. That is true, but it is static. The better truth is that Germany was repeatedly being forced to confront realities that arrived faster than its remaining institutions could emotionally and operationally absorb. The Oppenheim crossing is one of those realities. It shows the final Western barrier not collapsing in a grand cinematic apocalyptic moment, but being outthought, out-timed, and then outfed. That is much more interesting because it reveals the real shape of defeat. Defeat is often not a wall exploding. It is a sequence of assumptions failing in the wrong order. First, the Americans are not supposed to cross here. Then, they are not supposed to cross at night. Then, they are not supposed to hold the first hours. Then, they are not supposed to widen the bridgehead this quickly. Then, they are not supposed to get armor across so fast. Then, they are not supposed to be deep enough inland that the river no longer feels central. Each one of those sentences is survivable by itself. Together, they become a kind of mental suffocation. And the Americans were now extremely good at imposing that suffocation. This is why the crossing south of Mainz belongs in a long script like this. It is not merely a tactical success. It is a perfect lens for the American transformation your reference files keep orbiting. The same army that had stumbled so badly in North Africa had become a machine that could plan fast, move fast, improvise bridging fast, support success fast, and exploit surprise before the defender finished translating it into doctrine. Again and again in your uploaded texts, the Germans are not most unnerved by raw American strength by itself. They are unnerved by how quickly that strength becomes organized action. That is what frightened them about artillery, about maps, about squad movement, about adaptation, about armored systems. Oppenheim sits inside that same family of fear. The Americans were no longer just hitting hard. They were hitting in ways that forced the Germans to rewrite the problem while being attacked by it. There's another reason this part of the story matters. It clarifies the rivalry between the Allied commanders without reducing it to gossip. Patton wanted to cross quickly partly because he was Patton and because men like Patton always measure themselves against rivals. But there was something colder in it too. He understood that a fast crossing in his sector would not simply win prestige. It would multiply pressure across the German front by proving that the Rhine could be crossed without the long set-piece drama everyone had been trained to expect. It would strip away the comforting idea that the final barrier in the West would at least impose ritual. That mattered strategically because ritual is another word for predictability. Predictability is a gift to defenders. Patton's crossing took that gift and tore it up. Once he was over, every German commander elsewhere had to glance at his own sector with a new kind of unease. Not only where will they hit, but how little warning do we actually require before the answer is already too late? That is how pressure spreads in a campaign. Not just through roads and shells, but through altered imagination. And Patton altered. the German imagination the moment he crossed south of Mainz. Suddenly, the Americans were not merely stronger, they were less obedient to expectation than they had any right to be. That is deadly in a war's final phase because tired armies rely on expectation even more than fresh armies do. They do not have the reserves to answer every possibility. They need the enemy to behave. At Oppenheim, Patton refused to behave, and by the time the East Bank was filling with more men, more vehicles, more command posts, more bridging, and more forward pressure, the question for Germany had already become darker than whether this crossing could be contained. The darker question was whether the war in the West still contained any truly defensive moment at all, or whether every new line would now simply be another surface the Americans were going to turn into movement. That is the fear that grows after a crossing like this. Not that one river has been lost, but that the defender's entire method of buying time is running out of terrain. And once that fear settles in, the next phase of the story becomes even more revealing, because then we move beyond the crossing and into what Patton did best, using one successful rupture to make a whole region feel tactically older than it was by morning and strategically finished before it was ready to admit it. That was the final answer waiting on the east bank of the Rhine. Not a miracle, not a stunt, not a glorious act of pure will by one flamboyant general standing above history and bending it to his personality. What happened at Oppenheim was colder than that, and in the end, far more devastating. It was the moment a tired, battered, learning American army reached the last great river in the West and treated it not as a sacred obstacle, but as another problem to be solved before the enemy finished understanding the question. That is why this crossing matters, because it strips away the romantic lie that the end of wars arrives in a single, magnificent explosion. Most endings do not look like that. Most endings look like this. A commander reads the map faster, engineers move sooner, infantry crosses in darkness. The defender guesses wrong by just enough. The first reports are dismissed for just a little too long. The bridgehead holds for just a few more minutes than it should. The ferries keep moving. The armor gets over. The roads behind the line begin to change meaning. And then, before anyone on the losing side has emotionally accepted what is happening, the event is no longer an event. It is the new geography of the war. That is what happened south of Mainz. The Rhine did not fail because it was too small. It failed because Germany no longer had the institutional speed to make full use of something that large. The river was still immense. The river was still real. What had become unreal was the German hope that one more barrier could impose order on a battlefield being reorganized faster than German command could absorb it. And that is the deeper reason Oppenheim belongs in the same family as all those other moments your reference texts orbit. The fear is never just American strength by itself. Plenty of armies have been strong. The fear is the American ability by this stage of the war to turn strength into procedure with terrifying speed. Artillery that did not just hit hard but hit in systems. Maps that did not just exist but arrived more accurate than the enemy believed possible. Squads that did not just fight bravely but moved with a rhythm German veterans found difficult to predict. Tank units that did not just survive the better machines but made those machines fight the wrong battle. And here at Oppenheim, the same pattern appears again in its final Western form. A river crossing that did not just succeed, but succeeded before the defender finished translating it into the doctrine he was supposed to use against it. That is the real American transformation from North Africa to the Rhine. In Tunisia, they had looked like a force still arguing with reality. At the Rhine, they looked like a force that had learned how to use reality before the enemy could stabilize it. That is a much rarer military achievement than people think. Armies can learn. Many do. But not all armies learn quickly enough for the learning to matter inside the same war. The American Army did. That is one of the biggest truths hidden inside the entire European campaign. It did not begin the war in the West as the finest battlefield machine on Earth. It became something close to that by relentlessly studying its own failures, replacing what did not work, scaling what did, and feeding success with an industrial discipline Germany could no longer match. Oppenheim is one of the clearest late-war proofs of that. Evolution, because the crossing forces every lazy explanation to fall away. It was not won by a better river. It was not won by a broken enemy who simply chose not to resist. It was not won by myth. It was won because the Americans had become extremely good at doing several hard things at once. Reading terrain, acting under incomplete information, compressing preparation, accepting risk at the right point, supporting success before it died, turning a surprise into a structure, turning a structure into movement, and turning movement into a problem the defender had to keep rewriting while being punished by it. That is why German defeat here feels so revealing. The final Western barrier did not come apart in a grand apocalyptic gesture. It came apart as assumptions failed in the wrong order and then could not be repaired fast enough. The Americans are not supposed to cross here. Then, they are not supposed to cross tonight. Then, they are not supposed to survive the first hours. Then, they are not supposed to widen the bridgehead so quickly. Then, they are not supposed to move armor across so fast. Then, the river is not supposed to stop feeling central this soon. By the time all of those sentences have failed, the defender is not merely losing ground. He is losing the sequence by which ground can still mean anything. And once sequence is gone, the end approaches with a terrible quietness. Men still fight. Guns still fire. Vehicles still move. Orders are still written. But the future inside those actions is gone. They are no longer buying a recovery. They are buying fragments of delay. That is what makes the crossing at Oppenheim such a perfect final lens on the Western War. It shows Germany still capable of violence, still capable of resistance, still capable of local tactical pain, but less and less capable of turning any of that into renewed control. And it shows the Americans doing the opposite, turning local success into widened control almost immediately. That is the difference between a force still fighting and a force still shaping. By March 1945, Germany in the West was more and more often doing the first. Patton's army was still doing the second. Which brings us back to Patton himself. The temptation is always to end on the man, on the swagger, on the legend, on the theatrical personality striding through history like a force of nature. But that ending is too small for the story we have just watched unfold. Patton mattered, certainly. His impatience mattered. His instinct for disequilibrium mattered. His refusal to behave as expected mattered. But the more important ending is this. Oppenheim was the point where Patton's instinct met an army finally capable of making instinct operational at enormous speed. That was the true danger. Not the general alone, but the marriage of an aggressive command mind with a military machine mature enough to act before the enemy finished thinking. Once that marriage crossed the Rhine, the Western War stopped feeling like a campaign that might still be delayed by geography and started feeling like what it already was, a collapse being discovered by stages. That is the final verdict. The Rhine crossing the Germans never believed Patton would try was not just one more bold episode in a famous career. It was the moment the last Western barrier ceased to be a shield and became evidence. Evidence that Germany was running out of terrain, running out of sequence, running out of time. And the cruelest part of all is that none of it required one dramatic final catastrophe. Only a chain of wrong assumptions, broken in the wrong order, by an army that had become expert at making the next assumption fail before the last one had even been absorbed. That is what defeated Germany at Oppenheim. Not merely Americans on the far bank, but Americans inside the German decision cycle, inside the German timetable, inside the last defensible story Germany was still trying to tell itself about the West. Once that story broke, the river was just water. And beyond that water stood the real ending of the war. The Americans were no longer approaching Germany, they were already rearranging it.